Welcome to our cybersecurity news deep dive for November 15th, 2024. We've got quite a few reports and alerts to get through today, so let's jump right in.
Sounds good. Let's kick things off with the Department of Homeland Security. They've just released some brand new AI guidelines, specifically for securing critical infrastructure.
Okay, so we're talking power grids, water systems, transportation networks, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
What's the main focus here?
Well, the DHS is really pushing for a security-first approach. When it comes to integrating AI into these sectors, they're even calling these guidelines living documents, meaning they'll be updated as AI tech and the threats against it evolve.
Makes sense. AI is developing so rapidly, the guidelines need to be able to keep up. So what are some of the key takeaways here for someone working in critical infrastructure security?
I'd say the biggest one is proactive risk assessment. Before deploying any AI, operators are encouraged to thoroughly analyze potential vulnerabilities and come up with some mitigation strategies. The DHS is also really pushing for strong privacy protections, making sure that AI systems handle sensitive data responsibly.
So it's all about finding that balance between harnessing the power of AI, but also making sure it's used safely and ethically.
Exactly. And this whole focus on responsible AI development, it's not just limited to government agencies either. We're seeing a huge surge of interest in something called a Gen AI governance in the private sector as well. In fact, a company called SurePath AI, they specialize in this area. They just secured $5.2 million in funding.
Wow, that's a significant investment.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about the current cybersecurity landscape?
I think it really underscores how important it is for organizations to manage the risks that come with using generative AI. These tools can be incredibly powerful, but they also introduce new attack surfaces that need to be carefully secured.
So it's like SurePath AI's platform. It's kind of like a control panel
Yeah.
for all the generative AI running within an organization.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It helps companies embrace AI innovation without having to compromise security or comply.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Talk about a new threat that's popped up. On the browser front, Glove Stealer. What can you tell us about this one?
So Glove Stealer is a pretty sophisticated piece of malware. It targets Chromium-based browsers like Edge, Brave, Opera, you name it. What makes it really dangerous is its ability to bypass app-bound encryption.
Right, and for those who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what app-bound encryption is?
Sure. So app-bound encryption, it's a security mechanism that's designed to protect cookies from being stolen. Essentially, it ties the encryption keys to the specific browser application, which makes it way harder for attackers to steal those cookies.
Got it. So how does Glove Stealer get around that protection?
It exploits a vulnerability in something called the iElevator service, which is an internal component of Chromium-based browsers. And by taking advantage of this flaw, Glove Stealer is able to decrypt the keys it needs to steal sensitive information, like cookies, passwords, even crypto wallets.
Not good, especially considering how many people use Chromium-based browsers these days. So how is this malware being spread around?
Primarily through phishing emails. The attackers will send emails containing malicious HTML attachments. They're usually disguised as error messages or something like that if a user opens the attachment and clicks on the fake error message. It triggers the download and execution of Glove Stealer.
Ah, the classic social engineering tactic, combined with a clever technical exploit. This is why user awareness and vigilance is so important.
Absolutely. And these types of attacks, they often lead to some real-world consequences, like the data breaches we've seen lately. One example that comes to mind is the breach at Team Software. They're also known as WorkWave.
I remember that one. Nearly 100,000 individuals were impacted. What kind of information was compromised?
The attackers got access to systems containing all sorts of personal data. Names, addresses, social security numbers, financial information, the whole works. The breach was actually discovered back in July.
No.
But the full extent of the damage is still being assessed.
And then we also had that distributed denial of service attack, targeting Israel.
Right. That one hit a company called HIP Credit Card. They provide credit card processing services. The attackers flooded their systems with traffic, disrupted services for all kinds of businesses, gas stations, supermarkets, any place that relies on those credit card readers.
So it sounds like in this case, the attackers were more interested in causing chaos and disruption than actually stealing data.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. The attack lasted for about an hour. They also went after HIP Credit Card's communication suppliers, which amplified the disruption even more.
Okay, so let's move on to some vulnerabilities that have been discovered recently. Security researcher Mickey Jem has made some interesting discoveries regarding macOS.
Yeah, he uncovered multiple sandbox escape vulnerabilities in Mac OS, exploiting an often overlooked attack surface. related to XPC services.
Okay, so for those who aren't familiar with the technical side of things, can you break down what XPC services are and why they're a potential security risk?
Sure, so XPC services, they're a mechanism in macOS that allows applications to communicate with each other. And with the operating system itself, they're essentially small specialized programs that run in isolation, or sandboxes, to prevent them from interfering with each other or with the core operating system.
Okay, so the vulnerabilities Jin found, they essentially allow attackers to break out of these sandboxes.
Exactly. By exploiting flaws in how XPC services handle certain types of data, attackers could potentially gain elevated privileges and execute malicious code on a user's system.
And what's the status of these vulnerabilities now? Has Apple addressed them yet?
The good news is that Apple's already patched most of them, but there are still a few that are awaiting fixes.
It's a good reminder that even the most secure operating systems out there can still have weaknesses, and staying updated is absolutely crucial. Speaking of updates, sometimes it's not just operating systems that are vulnerable. Sometimes it's the very tools that we rely on for security.
That's definitely true, and we've got a prime example of that with the critical vulnerability that was discovered in the popular WordPress plugin, Really Simple Security.
Yeah, this plugin is used by millions of websites, so this is a big one. What can you tell us about this vulnerability?
So it's an authentication bypass flaw. It's tracked as CVE 2024-10924, and it could allow an attacker to log in as any user on a WordPress site, even an administrator, without needing valid credentials.
Wow, that sounds like a nightmare scenario. What kind of damage could an attacker do if they successfully exploited this vulnerability?
Oh, they could take complete control of the website, deface it, steal sensitive data, even use the site to spread malware to visitors.
That's scary stuff. So what should website admins do to protect themselves?
The good news is that patches were rolled out pretty quickly to address this flaw. The developers of Really Simple Security released version 9.1.2, which fixes the vulnerability. So the most important thing for admins to do is update to the latest version of the plugin immediately.
Good advice. Now let's talk about some unsettling news regarding zero-day exploits, starting with the development at Palo Alto Networks.
So Palo Alto Networks confirmed that a new zero-day vulnerability in their firewalls has been actively exploited.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be as familiar with these terms, can you explain what exactly a zero-day exploit is and why it's so concerning?
Of course. So a zero-day exploit, it's basically a vulnerability that's unknown to the software vendor, and therefore there's no patch available, which means attackers can exploit the flaw before the vendor even has a chance to fix it.
So in this case, attackers were already using this vulnerability before Palo Alto Networks knew it even existed.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, this particular flaw is very serious. It allows for remote code execution, meaning an attacker could take complete control of a compromised system.
That is definitely not good. So what are some immediate steps that our listeners can take to mitigate this risk?
The most important thing right now is to follow Palo Alto Networks guidance. They've released a security advisory with detailed info on how to mitigate the risk while they work on a patch. In the meantime, they're strongly advising customers to restrict access to their firewall's management interface and only allow connections from trusted IP addresses.
Makes sense. And on top of that, CISA just issued a warning about 2 additional vulnerabilities in Palo Alto Networks Expedition tool.
Yep. These ones are tracked as CVE 2024-9463 and CVE 2024-9465, and they're both rated as critical. They could potentially allow for arbitrary code execution, which again gives attackers full control over a compromised system.
Wow, Palo Alto Networks is not having a good week. It's interesting, though, that both of these vulnerabilities also impact their Expedition tool, which is used for network troubleshooting and analysis. Seems like everything's connected. So what's the bottom line here for users of Palo Alto Networks products?
Patch, patch, patch. These vulnerabilities are being actively exploited, so updating your systems with the latest security patches is absolutely crucial right now.
Can't stress that enough. All right, let's move on to some developments in the world of espionage and cyber attacks.
Sounds good. Let's dive in. Let's shift our focus now to the world of espionage and cyber attacks, where we're seeing some concerning developments from state-sponsored actors.
It seems like these groups are becoming more sophisticated and brazen all the time.
Absolutely. Just look at APT41, for example. They're a Chinese APT group. And BlackBerry just published a report on how they've expanded their light spyware operation to target Windows systems now.
Oh, wow. LightSpy's been making headlines for a while now. What's different this time around?
So they've added this new surveillance framework to their arsenal. It's called Deep Data. And it significantly boosts their ability to conduct espionage across multiple platforms. Looks like they're not just content with mobile devices anymore.
So deep data basically allows them to spy on a wider range of devices and applications. What exactly can this framework do?
It's pretty versatile. It's a modular framework that can target all sorts of communication platforms, browsers, even password managers. It can steal sensitive information, record audio, basically turn any compromised device into a listening post for APT-41.
It's kind of unsettling to think about. It seems like no platform is truly safe from these advanced persistent threats.
And it's not just China that we need to worry about either. Iranian state-sponsored hackers have also been pretty active, deploying new malware.
Oh, really? What have they been up to?
So Checkpoint Research, they recently uncovered this new remote access Trojan called WezRat. It's being used to target organizations in Israel.
WezRat. Okay, so another RAT. What makes this one stand out?
It's a pretty versatile tool. It can execute commands remotely, capture screenshots, steal sensitive data from infected systems, you name it. It's being deployed by Iranian actors, who are believed to be associated with the Cotton Sandstorm Group, also known as Emenet Pasargad.
Right, I heard of them. They've been on the radar for a while. What are their typical targets and objectives?
They usually go after government institutions, critical infrastructure providers, businesses with ties to Israel. Their motivations seem to be a mix of cyber espionage, disruption, and good old-fashioned data theft.
All of the above. These state-sponsored attacks, they really highlight the need for organizations to have strong cybersecurity defenses in place. It feels like it's a constant arms race, and the attackers are always one step ahead.
That's a good point. And sometimes those attackers find weaknesses in the very platforms that we trust to protect us. Take Google's Vertex AI platform, for example. Researchers at Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 recently revealed some pretty serious vulnerabilities there.
Vertex AI. That's a pretty popular cloud-based machine learning platform.
Yeah.
What kind of vulnerabilities are we talking about here?
They found 2 security flaws that could allow attackers to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data and services. These flaws are particularly concerning because they target custom job permissions. It's just a reminder that even the platforms we rely on
have weaknesses. So even if we're doing everything right, patching our systems, using strong passwords, there are still vulnerabilities out there that can be exploited. Did Google do anything to address these issues?
Luckily, they responded quickly and responsibly. Once the researchers notified them, they patched the vulnerabilities and took steps to prevent similar issues from popping up in the future.
That's good to hear, but it definitely serves as a reminder that no platform is perfect, and we always need to be vigilant when it comes to potential security risks.
Now, while we're on the topic of new threats, let's talk about this new data-stealing malware that's emerged from Vietnam.
Oh, is this related to the APT groups that we were discussing earlier?
No, this one seems to be the work of a cybercriminal group rather than a nation-state actor.
Yeah.
Cisco Talos has been tracking them. They're a Vietnamese-speaking group, and they've been deploying this new Python-based malware known as PXA Stealer.
PXA Stealer. Interesting. What makes this one unique? And who are they targeting?
So their primary targets seem to be government and education entities in Europe and Asia. What sets PXA Stealer apart is its focus on compromising Facebook business and advertisement accounts.
Facebook business accounts. Oh, that's an interesting target. Why would they go after those specifically?
Well, those accounts, they often have access to a lot of financial resources and valuable data. So by hijacking these accounts, attackers can launch targeted phishing campaigns, spread misinformation, or even just steal funds directly.
It just goes to show that cybercriminals are always looking for new ways to monetize their activities. They're constantly adapting and finding creative ways to exploit vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And speaking of vulnerabilities, we need to talk about this high-severity flaw that was discovered in PostgreSQL.
PostgreSQL, that's a pretty widely used database system. What's the deal with this vulnerability?
So it's tracked as CVE 2024-10979, and it allows even unprivileged users to manipulate environment variables within PostgreSQL.
Environment variables, I'm not super technical. Can you explain what those are and why it's a problem? If someone can manipulate them?
Sure. So environment variables, they're basically settings that control how software applications operate. By altering these variables, attackers could potentially gain unauthorized access to sensitive data, execute malicious code, or even take control of the entire database server.
Yikes. Okay, so what should PostgreSQL users do to protect themselves?
The good news is the PostgreSQL developers have already released patches for various versions of the software. So the most important thing is to update your systems, to the latest patched regions as soon as possible. This vulnerability is a good reminder that even well-established open-source software can have weaknesses, and staying on top of updates is crucial.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on. There's this new attack method that's been causing quite a stir. In the world of domain hijacking, it's called sitting ducks.
Right. This one exploits a pretty big oversight. By some DNS providers, they haven't been properly verifying domain ownership during the registration process, which leaves thousands of domains vulnerable to hijacking.
So you're saying someone could potentially register a domain that doesn't belong to them without any real verification.
Pretty much. And once they have control of the domain, they can redirect traffic, launch phishing attacks, spread malware, all sorts of nasty stuff.
So what are the implications here if a sitting ducks attack is successful? And who are the main targets?
Well, the consequences can be pretty severe for both individuals and organizations. We're talking reputational damage, potential financial losses, increased risk of malware infections. Infoblox actually did a report on this, and they found that tens of thousands of domains have been hijacked over the past 5 years using this method.
Wow, that's a lot. And who's behind these attacks?
Infoblox has identified over a dozen independent actors who are using this technique, including groups like Vacant Viper and Vextrio Viper. They all have different levels of sophistication and different motives, but their impact is undeniable. It really underscores the importance of having strong security practices in place at every level of the internet infrastructure.
It seems like it's a constant battle to stay ahead of these cyber criminals.
It definitely is. And sometimes those battles are fought in the courtroom, as we saw with the recent sentencing of Ilya Lichtenstein.
Ah, yes. The Bitfinex hack. That was a big one. For those who might not remember, can you give us a quick recap?
So back in 2016, Lichtenstein orchestrated the theft of roughly 120,000 bitcoins from the Bitfinex exchange. At the time, the stolen bitcoins were worth around $71 million, but today, that same amount would be worth over $7.6 billion.
Wow, from millions to billions. That's crazy. It really highlights the stakes in this whole cybersecurity game we're playing.
For sure, the scale of cybercrime is growing exponentially, and the potential for profit is attracting some very sophisticated criminals.
So what happened to the stolen bitcoins after the heist?
Well, Lichtenstein and his wife, Heather Morgan, they went on this complex spending spree, trying to launder the stolen funds, but law enforcement agencies were on their tail.
Sounds like something out of a movie. Were they successful in laundering the money?
Thankfully, no. Law enforcement managed to recover over 96% of the stolen bitcoins. And Lichtenstein was recently sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the heist.
It's good to see that cybercriminals are being held accountable, even in the world of cryptocurrency. Speaking of evolving threats, let's talk about SIM swapping and some recent developments in Android security.
SIM swapping has become a really common tactic for cybercriminals these days. It allows them to bypass two-factor authentication and gain access to victims' accounts. There was actually a case in Indiana recently where 3 individuals were arrested for their involvement in a SIM swapping operation.
How did they manage to pull that off?
They used fake IDs to convince mobile carriers to transfer their victims' phone numbers to SIM cards under their control. This gave them access to two-factor authentication codes that were being sent via SMS, which allowed them to bypass security measures and gain access to accounts.
It's a good reminder that relying solely on SMS-based two-factor authentication can be risky, but it seems like companies are starting to implement more robust security measures.
Yeah, for sure. Google, for example, has been pretty proactive in enhancing Android security. They've introduced some new real-time protection features, like scam detection in phone and Google Play Protect Live Threat Detection.
Those sound promising. How do those features work, and how do they improve user safety?
So scam detection in phone, it uses advanced algorithms to analyze incoming calls in real time. It can identify potential scam calls and give users the option to avoid them. And then Google Play Protect Live Threat Detection, it constantly monitors app activity on Android devices, and it can proactively identify and neutralize potentially harmful software before it can cause any damage.
So it's like having a personal security detail for your phone. Those are definitely some welcome additions. To the Android security arsenal, are there any other notable security enhancements that we should be aware of?
Let's talk about some significant developments. In the world of AI and critical infrastructure, let's talk about some significant developments. In the world of AI and critical infrastructure.
Okay, so this is something we touched on earlier. The Department of Homeland Security released these new guidelines aimed at integrating AI into critical sectors, like power grids and water systems.
Exactly. They're providing a roadmap for securely incorporating AI into these vital systems.
It sounds like a pretty comprehensive set of guidelines. Can you give us some of the key recommendations?
Sure, they're really emphasizing the importance of risk assessments before deploying any AI, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and figuring out how to address them. They're also stressing user data protection and making sure that AI development aligns with human-centric values.
So AI should be there to help us, not replace us entirely.
Right. It's all about finding that balance.
It definitely seems like a balanced approach, recognizing both the potential benefits
Yeah.
and the risks that come with AI. So what else is happening in the AI space?
Well, there's been a lot of investment activity in the area of AI governance. We talked about SurePath AI earlier. They just secured a significant amount of funding.
That's right, $5.2 million. What does their platform offer?
It's designed to help businesses manage the risks that come with using generative AI. They provide tools to detect, mitigate, and control the use of Gen AI within an organization.
So basically helping businesses use AI safely and responsibly.
Exactly.
Well, it looks like we've covered a lot of ground today, from AI and critical infrastructure to malware threats and domain hijacking.
There's a lot to keep up with.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed. And that's where Cybersecurity HQ comes in.
Yay. We offer a job board, breaking news, in-depth reports, and a weekly newsletter. That's read by over 70,000 cybersecurity professionals.
So if you're looking to stay ahead of the curve and
Yeah.
connect with other experts in the field, be sure to check out Cybersecurity HQ.
Absolutely.
And that wraps up our Cybersecurity News Deep Dive for November 15th, 2024. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.